Yeah, good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm happy to be here, and we're going to try to see how I'm going to make this not too academic because I can see this is a relaxed atmosphere, and I believe would want to make it a bit interactive. Okay, so we're talking about Nigerian poetry, and we're looking at how to bridge the gap. Well, when you talk about bridging the gap, what comes to your mind first? Something is missing. There's a hole somewhere. There's a gap somewhere. There's space that needs to be occupied. So, we're going to begin by looking at what poetry is, and then we're going to look at the schools, the different stages that we have, after which we're going to see where the gap is. Yes. And okay. Thank you. Okay, so what is poetry? Well, we want to look at it as a literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style. A work of literature where we're using words not the normal way that people would use in prose or in conversation, normal parlance. We are looking for how you're going to use the smallest number of words to create images that would strike your reader or your listener in such a way that the person will not forget what he or she has just read. So the words used are used in with intensity, compact, deep. Like I said, the last time I had to talk about poetry, I said when I was in school, my lecturer defined poetry as when you use words to express your feelings, deep emotions, profound feelings, profound emotions, those things that mere words cannot just express. So you look for the most powerful words to use to bring out what you have to say. So ideas are given intensity by the use of distinctive style. A type of literature that conveys thoughts, describes a scene, or tells a story in a concentrated lyrical arrangement of words. And then poems can be in structured form with rhymes and rhythm, or it can also come in free form. When we were in school, in secondary school, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Star, ah. You see the rhyme. But these days, contemporary poets, nobody bothers with the rhyme or the rhythm. So you can decide to make it structured with rhymes, and you may also decide to make it free. Next slide, please. Poetry may also be described as condensed form of writing. Highly imaginative and symbolic use of language. It uses figurative language. It may employ aesthetic and rhythmic forms of language. It may defy conventional boundaries. That's what we call poetic license, where you can see somebody writing a sentence it begins with a small letter. In conventional writing, you begin a sentence with a capital letter and end with a full stop. But in poetry, you don't have to obey all those grammatical rules. It has different styles, it has different forms and different themes. So you're using language in a compressed form. You're trying to use the smallest amount to give the deepest meanings. May I have the next slide, please? So we want to look at the generations of poets in Nigeria according to Onwumere 2010. We talk about different generations of poems. The first generation that we have is called the pre-colonial poetry. What poets used to do, what they used to write in pre-colonial times. That's between 1950 to 1970. The themes that you find in such poems are things to counter colonialism, colonial discourse, culture, tradition, and end colonialism. Generation 2 are those that are at that stage of colonialism. That's all they're writing about, all the torture, like South Africans, East African. When I was in secondary school, we read a poem that said, "Night is my greatest enemy." I also read Dennis Brutus' collection of poems, Hammer Blows. So, poets at that time were talking about things that had to do with the colonial struggle. Then generation 3, post-colonial poetry, the era of military oppression. That is after colonialism. What were writers, what were poets talking about in their poems? And then the next one, generation 4, contemporary poets. Some of us are here. Some of us fit into the category of contemporary poets. The important thing is that the themes and the concerns at that time were different. They are different because we say literature is the mirror of society. And poets are supposed to be, like somebody says, the thing about poetry is that it is performative. That is, the poet needs to use language to perform acts, actions, struggles, depending on what we're talking about. We know that African writing, African literature is all about protest, isn't it? It's all about protest because we're writing about the experiences, what is happening to us. When they started writing, when we had generation 1 and 2, when Nigerians started writing, Africans started writing, we had Chinua Achebe, we had Wole Soyinka and their contemporaries. What happened? Only the male writers were writing literature, novels, prose, and all that. And the women were being projected as weak, indolent, sex objects, and all that. And the women had to arise. What kind of literature do we call that? Feminist, isn't it? Because the women, Buche Mecheta and co. and her contemporaries had to come out to begin to tell us these stories from the female point of view. How are we portraying women in the writing? So in all the stages and seasons, they were all saying things that pertained to them at that particular time. So these are the stages that we have. And then, please, the next slide. We can also look at it from another point of view, from an academic point of view this time. I interviewed a professor of of African literature, and he disagreed with that classification. According to certain experts in literature, we have these classification, these stages. So, periodic studies in literature has 4 stages as well. But I'll talk about the difference later. The first stage is the pre-literate society. Before we got the white man coming to teach us about writing and all that, we had our own forms of expressing ourselves, isn't it? So we had oral tradition, we had legends, we had folk tale. So at that time, songs, there were performers, there were people that could sing use language figuratively to entertain. That was what we had at that time, oral tradition. So, after the pre-literate time, what we had, the next thing is colonial encounter. If you remember Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. What happened? Okonkwo's father was a great entertainer, isn't it? So there were things happening before the white man, the Europeans came to us. So we had our own literature. So when the colonial masters came, we had colonial encounter. So we started having things like slave trade. So writings then, the themes were talking about slave trade, and then we had the Negro spirituals who would sing songs to encourage themselves. They would sing songs to make them, just encourage themselves because of the bad conditions they were in during the slave trade. So writers like we find that Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Frantz Fanon, and their contemporaries. So from the colonial encounter, we move to post-independence literature. That time is after independence, supposedly. From post-independent literature, we move to neo-colonial literature. That was the period of disillusionment. What happened? The white man came, colonized, and people talked and talked. Literature was going, people were using their writings or whatever means to tell them to let go. Eventually, we got independence. But what happened? Did the colonialism lift? Not really. What happened? The people that we voted for, well, our fathers voted for, the people that were put in place to replace the white man brought in the same system that the white man brought in. So most of the people were disillusioned. They were discouraged. So the kind of literature you find at this point were those writers that were castigating the rulers of their time. No longer the white men, but this time Africans themselves who were subjugating their fellow Africans. So that's what we call neo-colonial literature. Now, my professor claims that all these three periods above, they come under the post-colonial literature, which is a bit different from the other classification that had a stage that they called post-colonial literature, because they believe that it went from one stage to the other and things were running concurrently. Now, we have the last group. Contemporary poets or contemporary writers. You and I. What do we write about? We're writing about the things that are happening in our immediate environment. What are the things happening in our context? What are the themes? Or what manner of writings do you have at that time? Protest literature by African poets. In the Niger Delta, we have Niger Delta literature, which is also a part of the protest. So at each level, poets were writing to condemn the society, to mirror the society, to reflect the things that were happening in their immediate environments. Can I have the next slide, please? When we talk about Niger Delta literature, we have different poets. I'm sure some of us have read Ibuari Kriko's Early Tears of the Delta. We have read Baine Ngage's The Earth Listens. And he had the poem, The Pestle Pounds. It pounds an ear into fine dust. It pounds the nose into mud flats. Talking about the subjugation, the things that happened to the Ogoni when the multinational oil companies brought in the army and the police to come to intimidate them on their own land. Okay, now bridging the gap. What do you mean by bridging the gap? We have that presumption that there is a gap that needs to be filled. Now, what is this gap? Is there really a gap? Because certain writers and certain critics have stated that at the different stages that we have, all the poets, all the writers were using language to mirror what was happening in their immediate society. Yet, we're saying there's still a missing gap. There's a missing link. We're still saying there's a gap that needs to be filled. We want to know, what is that gap? May I have the next slide, please? Now, I'm looking at Ernest Ogunyemi 2023. According to him, there's a gap. So can we really say with our full chest that we are creating a body of poetry that is part of a Nigerian tradition? Thank you. A way of writing that is different from any other way of writing that has ever existed. And he answers it. He says, my answer is in the negative. That means that all that we're writing, especially contemporary writers, I think his focus was on contemporary writers. He said they are not writing anything that recreates the Nigerian experience. So according to him, Nigerian poetry does not yet exist. Until they begin to capture the things happening in the immediate environment, there is no Nigerian poetry. So many of today's Nigerian poets are working within a tradition that is not ours. A tradition that is mainly American. And I'm asking, is this a gap? Do we agree that there is a gap? Do we agree that Nigerian writers, Nigerian poets, are not writing things that reflect the Nigerian experience? According to him, until we begin to see poems that have twe, until we begin to read poems that talk about the downfall, talk about the market seller. Can we have the next slide, please? That talks about the market seller, the fish seller in the market, talks about the generator that is disturbing the entire neighborhood, or the loud neighbor that will put his music very loud or will shout from the top of his house, at the top of his voice. Until we begin to have such things in literature, for him, there is no Nigerian poetry. Now, responding to him, Bestman Osemudiamen responds. According to him, and Bestman's paper was titled, title of the paper was Much Ado About the Criticism of Fourth Generation Nigerian Poetry. He said, we're making such a fuss about it. Is it really the case? In his own words, the recent criticism about contemporary Nigerian poetry, fourth generation, and indeed the crisis of consciousness have kept me in awe. He says he's surprised that people are complaining about contemporary poets in Nigeria, that they're not reflecting Nigerian experience. They're not talking about things happening to us. They're not talking about NEPA. They're not talking about all the things I mentioned earlier. So according to him, these arguments isolate art from life. Because who is the contemporary poet? Let's talk about a young man who has lived all his life in Port Harcourt town, does not know anything about the village, does not know anything about the town crier, does not know anything about the masquerade, probably been on the TV, on the internet all his life, watching cartoons and movies, and he begins to write. Will he be writing about the town crier? In this age, where everything has gone technical, when the technological age, and we know that the world has become a global village, can you really condemn the contemporary African writer or African poet, the Nigerian poet? All right, so his arguments are that these arguments isolate art from life and therefore do not address the crux of the matter. Please let me have the next slide. Like I have 2 minutes. May I have the next slide, please? Somebody else also speaks against this argument. He says the new school of poets have shifted their space from Nigeria into Americanism. And due to the shape-shifting tendencies of this generation, missing the link, missing the link between the poets of the third generation and the emergence of the fourth are the instances where They converge and the part. It is easier to accuse contemporary Nigerian writers, especially her poets, of not representing their reality. Please let's have the next stage, the next slide. Discussion, which we may not have, but I'm trying to talk about all that. Let's move to the next slide, please. The real question is, as Bestman asks, how will you describe our reality in the current age of AI, globalization, and digitization? Can we really return to the past? Should we return to past history and failures? What is the culture of the young man who lived all his life in Canada in a typical urban Nigerian community? What is the place of a town crier in the young poet's reality? Please, next slide. Okay? So different people are saying things about bridging the gap. Afamake proposes a bridging of the gap between poetry as an intellectual phenomenon and the common people in Nigeria who ordinarily loathe poetry. For him, poetry should embrace the ordinary people and be deployed as an agent of cultural change. Please, the next slide. Maybe just take me to the last slide. Okay, let's think serious about this. Do you like poetry? Is it popular in your neighborhood? How can poetry embrace the ordinary people? I'm trying to say that. Please just move to the last slide. Second to the last slide, please. So we're looking at how can we embrace the people? How can we make them love poetry? We see a lot of people that are creating content, isn't it? What do? They come, put their cameras and begin to say things. We talk about spoken word poetry, isn't it? We talk about making videos and creating content. Is it possible for the contemporary poet to begin to also use different means to produce or to read out his or her poems? Video yourself. First of all, talk about the current happenings in the country. Video yourself and talk about it. If everybody begins to talk about all that is happening around him using the appropriate poetic forms, I believe we can reach the people, entertaining them through poetry. Innovations in poetry writing. We could do digital poetry, computer algorithms, coded poetry. These are new experiments that are being explored in advanced nations. So I'm trying to say, let me just conclude. In pre-literate society, poetry was in the form of oral tradition. We had folk tales, we had songs. People were entertaining using language. Then, it was very dynamic and easy to manipulate. It was related to music, dance, drama, and visual art. However, in the era of the print media, the printed word has reduced poetry to verse in print form. Gladly, technology is here to release poetry and project back to that dynamic interdisciplinary genre which had been its original form. Poets in Nigeria should embrace the use of technology to bring back the purity of poetry, to re-engineer and reactivate the purity and multidisciplinary nature of poetry. We need to make poetry financially viable for poets in Nigeria. All these things are in the slides that I put there. How we can use poetry, that the poet can produce content and advertise himself through social media. I didn't get to those slides. Through social media, you could advertise yourself using the different tools that I just read out. Using even just your camera, you could begin to speak out against injustice in the society, against the things happening, using figurative language, and you can make your presence felt on social media. That way, we are extending poems or poetry in Nigeria to other parts of the world. Thereby, you make money, like all the content creators are using social media to get themselves rich. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, please put your hands together for the prof.